All right, good evening, brothers. Welcome to the September 17th edition of the educational series from the Minneapolis Valley of the Scottish Rite. We have, as we've talked about before, this isn't a tiled meeting, so please be kind and courteous. These are recorded. I just turned that recording button on. If you as I asked also, please keep yourself on mute. Use this chat feature to send any questions in, and there will be a survey at the end that I'll post in the chat and also send out via email later on. Please fill those out, submit them. That information is sent off to the presenter anonymously. No names are tied to it, so that we don't have to worry about that part. We do have a couple more, 3 or 4 more left in our cycle here. Some Alchemy, the Book of the Dead, The Third Eye, again by Brother Hans, and Enoch as well. And now, Brother Hans, I will stop share, and it is all yours.
Okay. So let's see here. Okay, is it coming through?
Yes, it is.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. So as Jason mentioned, we're going to talk about the sacred geometry, or the big G in Masonry, and hopefully by the end of the kind of a presentation, you will see that the lines between the G's in Masonry start blurring, meaning geometry and God. So before we get into it, a quick kind of a, because the screens will be pretty heavily populated, and unless you're really totally immersed into selfies, I suggest what you do is, there's in the panel, there is a button here, generally in upper left form, where you can minimize it, so then at least you can see everything that's on the slides, there are 3 little buttons on the bottom. If you click on that, you can hide the video panel. So at least then you can see everything that's going to be presented in the presentation. So with that said, let's get started here. So what is geometry? Well, geometry comes from the Greek, geo meaning earth, and metron being measurement. So geometry is actually measuring the earth. And while historians tell us that the earlier records date back from about 2000 BC, are found in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Babylonia, we, just by looking at the various structures that were in existence long before that, we know that there was a very fundamental understanding of geometry that enabled these guys to build these structures. And frankly, the Greeks advanced it. There are some names that we as Masons know: Thales, Pythagoras, Euclid, etc. But also the Greeks served as a kind of a gateway to bring that ancient knowledge of geometry into the Western world. So, as a preface to this presentation, and again, these are little intros, geometry generally arises out of observing nature. But by the same token, also geometry can provide us with observations in nature. And I will give 2 examples of that so it becomes a little bit clear. Now, one thing that we do need to appreciate is that ancient geometry was not a standalone discipline. It was an integral part and a fundamental part of philosophy. And so it's not kind of what we know today. It was interwoven with philosophical thinking. And it was taught in these ancient mystery schools. And actually, as worshipful brother Justin Thompson kind of articulated some sessions ago, is that the Scottish Rite is one of those ancient mystery schools, preserving the knowledge from ancient times. And as a matter of fact, in a broader definition, Freemasonry is a ancient mystery school. I mean, we are taught and learned that it all started in 1717, but the knowledge that flowed into Masonry obviously dates way back earlier than 1717. And for practical purposes, every Freemason is an initiate. So these ancient mystery schools really had a charter of discovering nature's secrets, understanding God in oneself. So, and there were the initiates, and every Freemason is to some extent an initiate, where you are exposed to the science, the arts, the geometry, etc. And then the most adept, they really started diving into this relationship between philosophy, symbolic aspects of geometry, and that's kind of where we start talking about the sacred aspect of sacred geometry. So as a reminder, and as we know as Mason, a geometry is full of symbols, and a symbol is a visible representation of the invisible. And as Mason, we know a lot of those are symbols and their symbolic meaning. I mean, if we look at the square, it's the square represents the equitable and fair treatment in dealing with each other. But from a philosophical standpoint, it also represents the material plane, meaning the plane where we do our earthly matters and experience our earthly endeavors. Similarly, the triangle are represented by the 3 Masonic lights and their respective symbolic meaning, which we don't go into here. But from a philosophical standpoint, the triangle represents the spiritual plane and guiding our earthly matters. And kind of to illustrate this point a little bit as an entered apprentice, remember your triangle is flipped upward and the square is below. So your spiritual and your earthly matters are still divided. Once you became a fellow craft and subsequently Master Mason, now the the triangle comes down, meaning your spiritual the spiritual is now guiding your earthly matters. So that's kind of and then last but not least, in Masonic context, we have the circle. The circle subscribes the boundaries of our actions, but in a philosophical sense, the circle also represents the cosmic plane, meaning the infinity of the great architect. So as Masons, we are familiar with symbols. As Masons, we are familiar with symbolic expressions that we know as symbols. And as I said before, geometry is quite often fueled by observations and the other way around too. So let's take a look at how geometry is fueled by observation. What you see here is a pole or a little ball on top of it, or a light source behind it, and the pole obviously casts a shadow, okay? And if we now pay attention to what's going to happen once we start moving that light source, is that the shadow starts traveling. And if we observe what is happening here, is that the shadow casts an arc. And if we complete that, then actually it becomes a circle. So through observation, meaning by observing the shadow, we see we gain an understanding of what the light has done, right? And if we tinker around with math and numbers, we find out that the circle has a surface area of pi r square and a circumference of 2 pi r. But it also implies that the light source has traveled that same pattern. So in other words, what we see here is by observing the effect, we can explain something about the origin, meaning what caused that effect. And actually, the Greeks were actually pretty clever in this. And there's this guy, his name is Eratosthenes. He was a Greek astronomer in about 240 BC. And he used this method and extended it, actually. What he repeated these measurements throughout the year and did this at different locations, and found that if you do this in the summer, and if you do this in the winter, and if you do this at different locations, the shadows that are being casted give you a great idea, actually a pretty accurate idea, what is happening in the planetary regions. And he was the very first one, maybe not the first one, but certainly the one who proved that the Earth is no longer a flat thing, but it's actually a sphere. And by using this very same fundamental geometry that we're talking about here, he was able to calculate the circumference of the Earth with an accuracy of about 3%. So it's really phenomenal how observation, in essence, leads to disclosing something about the origin. So if we then look at what they learned from these observations, is that obviously the observation tells us something about the origin, right? But also the cause and effect that follow a certain order and the design. Because it's not just that they saw the sun casting a shadow, they saw a similar kind of a phenomena happen in nature and started recognizing there's an order. And through geometry, you can capture that order and start applying that obviously in other aspects of life. So What they quickly realized that through geometry, and we need to remind ourselves geometry was a part of philosophy, is that geometry holds a key to understanding a fraction of the divine order, right? However, that also prompted some questions. And one of the most obvious one that mankind has busied centuries ago, millennia ago, as well as today, is who and what created this order in nature and why? The question that follows out of that is that if I exist within a divine order, which we obviously are, am I subject to that very same order, right? And then last but not least, that's where geometry falls into the philosophical aspect again, is that could geometry help me understand deity, nature around me, and last but not least, myself? So that's an example where our observations fuel geometry. The next one is, how can geometry fuel an observation? And for that, we're going to go take a quick look at the Fibonacci sequence, also called the golden ratio. And it might be a little bit of a challenge, but as a precursor to this, we first, over the next 10 minutes, going to review quadratic equations and third order derivatives. So if you need a drink, I would say go now and come back 10 minutes later. No, I'm just kidding. So we're going to make this very simple here. So what is the Fibonacci sequence? Well, it's actually, you start adding up numbers, and I'll take you through this, how this works. So basically, you take the last number plus the sum of the previous, and you add them up. So in this case, 1 plus 2 yields 3. You keep repeating this. 2 plus 3 yields 5. 3 plus 5 yields 8. And it goes on and on and on and on, infinitely. Now, you might ask, what's the deal with these numbers? Well, actually, where it really gets interesting is if you take the sequence. So an example here is that if you take 5 divided by 3, the quotient is 166. If you take the next set of numbers, 8 and 5, you divide that, it's 1.6. The next set of numbers, 13 divided by 8, yields 1.62, etc., etc. It turns out, if you go bigger and bigger and bigger in numbers, the quotient is always 1.61. And that number is called phi, where geography you are, and it's called the golden ratio. And I'll explain, because we're still in the math portion of it, so I'll explain where the ratio will happen in nature. Now, the same thing we can do through geometry. So basically, if we start off with a square, just a little block here, 1 by 1, so 1 width, 1 height. And like we have done up here, if we add another block to it, we get 2, or we get 2 blocks. If we add 1 plus 2, we get 3, right? So that's what we did up here. 1 plus 2 yields 3. 1 plus 2 yields 3. So if we add, now in the next block was 2 plus 3, so we add now 3 to it, we have 5. If we add 2 to 5, the 3, 2 to 5, we have 3, 5, and the answer is 8. So here, if we take these, the width and the height, we see our first manifestation of the golden ratio, 1.6. If we keep repeating what we're just doing, so we have 3 plus 5 yields 13, so we add 8 to it, we get 13. And again, if we take 13 divided by 8, we get 1.62. Now, you might ask, what is this all about? Well, let's take a next set of kind of a tinkering that Fibonacci did. And he says, well, I have all these blocks. I see that in numbers as well as in geometry, I always end up with 1.61, okay? Where it really gets interesting is if you take each block and divide it by its arc, you get a nice little spiral. And it's called the Fibonacci spiral or the golden spiral. Now, even if you didn't quite track what's kind of displayed here, just remember 2 things. 1.61 and a nice curly little pigtail, okay? So now we're going to take that spiral and go into nature and say, well, where do we find this? Well, it turns out that many plants orient their leaves following the Fibonacci spiral. The nautilus expands as it ages, following the spiral of Fibonacci. Most flowers arrange their petals in a pattern like the Fibonacci spiral. The sunflower orients the seeds in the Fibonacci spiral. That's, by the way, the most effective way of utilization of surface area, meaning that's the highest density of seeds you can obtain if you follow that sequence. Cacti do the same. As a matter of fact, all galaxies following the pattern of the Fibonacci spiral. Bees and or insects are the facets of their eyes are oriented in the Fibonacci spiral. As a matter of fact, if you look at the bee colony, the number of female to male ratio is 1.61. Hurricanes orient themselves following the spiral of Fibonacci. In nature, the golden ratio we find in many classic architecture. You remember these little squares that we tinkered with on the previous page? Because it's pleasing to the eye. Actually, our bodily anatomy follows the golden ratio fairly exact. If you take the distance from the tip of your finger to the first digit and divide the length of your finger by the distance between the finger and the first digit, it's 1.61. Similarly, from the wrist to the neck is 1.61. And there are many 1.61 aspects in our body. Turns out that our DNA, the folding of the DNA, follows the Fibonacci spiral. The base structure of the pyramids follow phi. Many trees branching out following the Fibonacci sequence, 1, 3, 6, 5, 8, etc. So here's the question. Is this coincidence, or is there a divine order at work? Right? It's too prevalent in nature to fall into the silly little number 1.61 and the silly little curve from Fibonacci. And frankly, it turns out that there is a divine order at work. So, but out of this particular observation, we recognize there is an order to what we perceived previously as random. Remember, this is an example where geometry guides our observation. And we learn from this that nature is shaped according to some universal and rather invisible rules. But through geometry, we discover some of that divine order. And I quote here, a quote is, if there's a clock, there must be a clockmaker. So that's kind of, Voltaire came up first with that. Descartes and Einstein had their own variations. So again, we are facing with some prompting questions. Namely, if all this is happening in nature, who created this and why was it created? And again, the same questions we ask ourselves here is that if I exist within the divine order, am I subject to that same order? So by looking then at geometry, could I gain a better understanding of deity and myself? And that was really the major theme in these ancient mystery schools. And many of those questions, but also symbols and geometry survived in masonry. So with that, we're going to transition now into what I call philosophical geometry. So what we need to place ourselves into is in a mode of thinking like these ancient philosophers did. They looked at a shape and tried to understand, what can I extract in meaning and content out of this? So let's start with the circle and square. So we know as Masons that a circle is a representation of the infinite divine, right? The square, we know, is also representing our earthly matters and our earthly endeavors. So now the square in the circle only partially covers the circle. So that green area is kind of the unexplored aspect of it. And if you're watching this webinar on the black and white TV, it's not green, it's gray, showing up gray in your screen. So if we add now a circle, meaning an earthly cycle to this, what we arrived at is the octagon. And what the octagon is a rough and earthly approximation of the circle. Again, these are all symbols you'll find in most of the Blue Lodge degrees, and certainly within the Scottish Rite, there's not a single degree that does not bring these geometric patterns and the symbolic interpretation into it. So let's take a look at the philosophical interpretation of this particular octagon here, or what the square and the octagon represent. A single square, as we saw, only covers a portion of the circle. The philosophical interpretation that the ancient gave to this is that man cannot comprehend deity in a lifetime, right? Each new experience, meaning each new square that we're adding, leads up to an increased understanding of the whole, which is true. It starts filling up the circle, approximating the circle closer and closer. But even if you would go through an infinite number of worldly incarnations, meaning an infinite number of squares, you will never be able to fully fill the circle, but only approximate the circle. So this is kind of a philosophical statement where through experience and gathering of experience, we start gaining a more fundamental understanding of the whole or the situation on hand. So that's one. So let's move on to the triangle. And again, we need to remind ourselves that the symbol is a visible representation of something invisible. And as Masons, we know that the triangle represents the spiritual plane, meaning guiding our earthly endeavors. Now, if we fill this circle with some dots, we have created what's called Pythagorean tetractys. And not unlike in the Kabbalah, where we have 10 Sephiroth, we have 10 dots here, the connecting these lines has a very specific meaning, as it has in the Kabbalah. And Brother Gene last week did a marvelous job explaining this. So let's connect some of those dots here and take a look at how the ancient philosophers basically interpreted this. Well, first and foremost, we see that the outer triangle still represents the philosophical concept of the deity. However, when we start segmenting the origin, we create a number of new triangles that in essence have the exact same properties as the larger triangle from which they came, okay? And what this in a philosophical from a philosophical standpoint represented is that creation is a division of the divine, meaning of the larger triangle, and all things that have been created and divided from it, whether it be on the macro or microcosmos, retain an element of the origin. Meaning that if we view ourselves as a part of a creation, we have retained an element of the origin. So that's kind of from a philosophical sense what this represents. So if we continue on the path of the tetractys and connect some other dots, we see that as these are connected, what ultimately comes out of it is two equilateral triangles. They're also known as the Seal of Solomon or the Shield of David. And if we start reflecting on the philosophical interpretation, is what we see that the upward pointing part of the triangle in alchemical terms represents the masculine, the fire. In Masonry, we recognize as St. John the Evangelist. If we look at the downward pointing, it's representing the feminine, the water. And from a Masonic standpoint, St. John the Baptist. And as you might already see here, you see the square and compass almost kind of extracting out of this. But we also see that the star are a composite of dark and light, represents the balance, finding the union, finding completion. That's kind of the deeper meaning behind the Seal of Solomon. And in the center, which we don't have time to talk about, is the hexagon. And that's a story by itself too. So that's again another manifestation of how the tetractys is facilitating a philosophical discussion and a philosophical reflection on you and your interaction within your surroundings. And here's the last part of the tetractys where we reflect on the cube. So if we connect same points as we did before, what will kind of appear is a six-sided cube, which we as Masons know to be the perfect ashlar. And reflecting again on some philosophical interpretation is that even though this is a two-dimensional plane, we can discover a three-dimensional object within that two-dimensional plane. Said differently, with effort, we can obtain amazing insights, whether that's in the interaction with a person, or reflecting on the subject matter, or the interaction between people. If we then look at that curve, or that cube, what you will notice is that, and that's the characteristic of a cube, is that there are only three sides visible. Yet we do know that as you change this cube around, or by just the sheer manifestation of the cube, that while there are only three visible, there are always three hidden ones. And a philosophical interpretation around that is that life is not always what we observe. Meaning, sometimes you have to change your point of view to gain a better understanding of what is life about. So, brother, in closing, hopefully we've been able to at least kind of show that sciences, in particular geometry, have enabled mankind to unveil some of the divine working of the great architect. Through geometry, we have discovered that there are principles, there are rules, there's a divine plan, and as Plato nicely phrased it, God is always geometrizing. The philosophical aspect of geometry are clearly aimed at exploring oneself, and Socrates basically phrased it by putting this on top of his school, know thyself, right? And in that exploratory journey, also assess your interaction within the divine work. And that's why it is called sacred geometry. So that's kind of the last slide. And that, I would like to thank you for kind of joining me on this kind of expose of sacred geometry. It's just an introduction. There's a lot more to the subject matter, but in essence, it's a reflection on geometry as a means of really understanding yourself and the world around you. So with that, I'm going to stop the share. And then we can open up for questions.
Oh, thank you, Brother Hans. Before we start with the questions, I'd like to just wrap up let's talk about the upcoming schedule here real quick. As we have here, The Alchemy, the Book of the Dead, and I will be posting that survey link here in a few moments for everyone to do. So with that, I am going to stop the recording and